The New York City subway and the London Underground are not just the most famous rapid transit systems in the English-speaking world, but two of the most iconic and influential transportation systems in history. From extensive networks to famous maps, their inclusion in iconic films, and essentially becoming an integral part of their respective city. So the question is only natural. In a one-on-one cage match, which system would win? But seriously, looking at the ways the different systems compare and contrast and excel and sort of fall behind is a great way of seeing how they can improve and create better transit that attracts more riders and makes existing ones more happy. So let's get into it. The New York City subway versus the London Underground. I hope you're excited for the return of the Transport Battle series with this updated episode on the London Underground versus the New York City subway. In this video, we'll be exclusively comparing the subway to the Underground, so as much as I'd like to bring in the path or the DLR, we won't be doing it at least in this video. Now, if you have a great idea for a transport battle, leave it in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. With that out of the way, let's start where any trip on rapid transit starts, at the stations. The quality of a transit station depends on a ton of different factors. Both New York City and London have stations which are very iconic. New York with its domes at the entrances and wrought iron, and London with iconic old buildings and roundels all over the place. At platform level, the tube station design is probably more famous, but New York stations with their exposed steel columns are probably even more universal to the system. Now, accessibility is a huge problem for both of these systems. New York has a greater number of accessible stations, but a lower proportion of its overall stations are accessible. On the other hand, some stations in London have truly atrocious non-level boarding, which owes to the fact that the subsurface and deep-level underground lines have trains with different floor heights, despite interlining and sometimes using the same platforms. Cleanliness is another story. And while both systems have stations that run the gamut from really gross to quite nice, I would say that the average New York station feels darker and less clean than the average London station. I think overall this is helped by the general aesthetic of London stations, which tend to feature a lot more tile that's just probably easier to keep clean than all of the complex steel that you see in New York stations. I also didn't experience rats to anywhere near the same extent when riding on the Underground recently compared to the New York City subway. Now, all of that being said, I do want to give kudos to New York for its enhanced station initiative, which really does make enhanced stations feel super nice. The only issue I see with it is that it doesn't apply nearly broadly enough, so you might have a really nice station in one place and kind of a dingy one in others. It's also really good that both systems now allow you to pay contactless with credit and debit and have their own contactless smart cards, which is something that wasn't true just 5 years ago. That being said, when you're tapping your card, New York loses out because turnstiles, in my personal opinion, are just worse than fare gates. You never walk into a fare gate and feel like you might need to head to the hospital because you've done some damage to your body, which is the case with turnstiles sometimes. Overall, both systems have a lot of work to do, and both systems have their great iconic elements, but overall, London is just in a better place with the state of its stations, so it wins this round. Now, when you go to a station, you go there to get on a train. So how do London and New York's trains actually stack up? Like a lot of rapid transit systems, both New York and London have two main classes of trains, one larger and one smaller. In London, it feels like the smaller tube trains make up about 60% of the network, while in New York, the ratio feels roughly reversed. When you actually look at the larger train stock, I would say it's a slight win for London. The S stock is more attractive and fully walk-through. That being said, given London's famous for its good wayfinding, something I did notice when actually riding on the S-Stock trains versus the larger trains in New York is that I think New York just simply wins on wayfinding. On the S-Stock, you get an LED signboard that tells you the next station, but in New York, on many trains, you get the large LED boards that show you the next several stops and a lot of the stops towards the end of the line, as well as the convenient connections you can make at each one, which is just super useful. Even though this isn't something super new, I think this is a really underappreciated feature of New York's trains. At the same time, the most recently updated New York City rolling stock has far more screens than London's rolling stock, which makes for more interesting advertising and potentially better wayfinding. The tube stock is all very constrained by the tight tunnels it has to operate within, and that ultimately just creates a lot of issues. The headroom is lacking, the trains are very narrow, and the space is incredibly constrained within them, which isn't great for accessibility. I also think to a kind of crazy extent that the newest deep-level tube stock feels incredibly similar to the oldest deep-level tube stock that's still in service. And that's not great, because you'd expect that over roughly 40 years there would be more significant improvement. Now yes, that is a testament to the difficulty of designing a train that can fit within those deep-level tubes, but more improvement, again, would be good. At the same time, unlike New York's smaller rolling stock, which basically just feels like a smaller version of the larger trains, the tube trains don't have air conditioning, which can be really rough on a hot London day. Ultimately, I think for the smaller rolling stock, New York gets a big win. Now, seating on the trains is obviously important, and I think both systems get some elements right. I appreciate that London's trains have seats with significant padding, especially on the older trains, something which basically none of New York's trains have. That being said though, the plastic seats used in New York mean they're a lot easier to keep clean, and if they're a bit messy, you can wipe them clean easily with a napkin. Now you might mention that London is getting new tube trains, the New Tube for London program with Siemens, but at the same time, New York is also getting new fully walk-through subway trains, and so that's kind of a wash. And so I think ultimately in the trains category, New York wins, even if I think the trains are less cool looking. Trains are great, but if you're left waiting on a platform for a long time, that isn't great. And generally, I think London has better system-wide service, which probably owes to the fact that New York is just far more heavily interlined throughout its subway network. Yes, London does have interlining, but just a less substantial part of the network. London also has, on the whole, more modern and better signaling, which not only allows for super high frequency trains that are also semi-automated, which yes, do exist in New York, but in less locations, but also higher reliability and less delays, which again is super important when you have a lot of interlining. And the most heavily interlined portion of the London Underground network, the subsurface lines, is being slowly, and in a delayed fashion, upgraded entirely to communications-based train control. Of course, New York does have a couple of very powerful tricks up its sleeve. Express service is available in both cities, but it just exists far more broadly in New York. And all of that extra track that enables express services means that New York has very comprehensive 24-hour service every single day of the week. London does now have 24-hour service, but it's only on Friday and Saturday nights. And while I think that's probably mostly good enough for most people, week-long is just super powerful. And really, short of Copenhagen, which I talked about in a recent video, just not that many subway systems have 24-hour service every day of the week, and that's something special. With that kept in mind, I think this round comes out as a tie. Now with service comes connectivity, and both systems can get you pretty much anywhere you want to go in their respective cities. Though New York, with over 100 more stations, does just get you to more places. And that being said, there are still major deficiencies in both systems. South of the Thames in London is just not that well covered by the tube, and west of the Hudson in New York isn't covered by the subway at all. And yes, it's a different state, but it's still part of the New York metropolitan region. And the fact that there isn't a unified transport agency like TfL in the New York region is a big problem. While London's fares are more expensive than New York, and the city-wide flat fare of New York does feel incredibly powerful, the fact that you can get on any rail transport on the zonal system in London is really useful. And that's helped by the fact that outside of the tube and the subway, London does have more mainline and other types of rail networks, whereas New York does have a few major commuter railways and the Hudson Bergen Light Rail and the Path, but just not as much as London. Now this integration is something you also see with cross-platform transfers. Both systems do have a large number of them, but London has more to other services outside of the tube network than New York has to services outside of the subway network. So on this round of connectivity, it goes to London. The next category is expansion, and on expansion, I don't think either system is doing nearly enough, especially given the deficiencies I mentioned in the previous category. And part of the reason for this is because prices for new projects in both cities have gone through the stratosphere. That being said, given that the Elizabeth line is not a tube line, only New York is building a brand new subway line through the center of the city, even if it is moving incredibly slowly. 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 2 will probably be done in a decade and a half or so, and London just doesn't have any tube projects moving forward right now. And so New York just barely wins in this category. The last category is the wildcard category. It's always hard to categorize every single element of a rapid transit system, and so I like to have this final category to give attention to some of the lesser appreciated elements of both of the systems that wouldn't fit in the other categories. Broadly speaking, I feel like London's system felt more modern about 10 years ago, especially since it features platform screen doors, even if only at a few stations. In recent years, though, New York's incorporation of really good digital wayfinding and digital screens on trains just makes it feel very futuristic. Speaking of wayfinding, both systems do have iconic and great wayfinding systems, and I'm personally a big fan of New York's semi-geographically accurate subway/city map. That being said, across the system, London's wayfinding just feels like it's higher quality and in better shape. And I also feel like it's generally more helpful. London has also done a better job, in my personal opinion, of incorporating heritage elements of the system into the modern system, whether that be old platform finishings or old head houses for stations. It all makes it feel a bit like the cliche of a museum that you can actually physically use. Now, while a large portion of the tube network goes through very low-density suburban areas and even rural areas in some cases, New York subway just takes you to more interesting destinations with all of its elevated lines in the outer boroughs, which make for fantastic vistas and pictures of the city and the subway system itself. London just doesn't have nearly as much elevated track on its system. That being said, the tube can actually take you to Heathrow, something which the New York City subway frustratingly doesn't do for any of the New York area airports. This forces you to take a silly airport shuttle train for the last mile to JFK or a bus to LaGuardia, and that might be fixed in the future, but for now, Heathrow's connection is just better. One thing I can't say I miss about London, though, is the incredibly, painfully loud sound in the deep level tubes. Now, it's not universally bad, but in particular on the Jubilee Line extension, one of the newest portions of the network, it is just ear-crushingly loud and shrill and just an incredibly unpleasant experience. Now, New York's trains are not perfectly silent, but there's nothing I've experienced in New York quite as painful as on the Jubilee Line extension and parts of the Northern Line. Now, with all of that said, one of the biggest problems that large metro systems face is that getting across them can be incredibly time-consuming. Now, to be fair, the Elizabeth Line does solve this problem to some extent, but it's not part of the tube, and it is really only just one line. New York City's subway's express services are not just powerful because they're express services, but because they add an entire new layer onto almost the entire network since they're so broadly available. And it's really not just to make getting from one suburb to another or from the suburb to the city center easier, but getting through the densest parts of New York is incredibly fast in a lot of different directions thanks to the express trains. For example, going from Lower Manhattan to Midtown is very fast if you catch an express, whereas in London you don't have that many options to go through the center at high speeds unless you're talking about the Elizabeth Line. And so the express services in New York are very, very powerful and still probably underappreciated, and a feature that no other metro system implements to the same extent as New York. At the same time, the Elizabeth Line is kind of heralded for having these giant stations with giant trains, but they're really not all that much bigger than the larger trains in the New York City subway, which just sort of goes to show you how the express services and the large stations throughout Manhattan and the rest of the city are really underappreciated. It's also worth mentioning that London has a lot more deep underground stations than New York, which are just less convenient to access, even with lots of escalators. Despite all of that though, I think the general better condition of London's system and the fact that it gets you to more of the critical places that you need to go without having to switch to other systems means that it just barely edges New York out in the wildcard category. And so with that, we have it, London wins, but just barely, and probably less so than 5 years ago. While New York has been doing a pretty good job at aggressively fixing its main problems, London seems to be stubborn on some of them. To be completely fair, London would probably win handily if we were to include the entire TfL network, which features the Elizabeth Line, the Overground, which is super useful for suburb-to-suburb circumferential trips, as well as the trams, the DLR, and even more. At the same time, London does a way better job of using what it has, whether that be better signaling that allows more trains on the older lines, to keeping its stations in a better state of repair. What I will say though is that London needs to do a better job of continuing to incrementally improve its system. The older S-Stock trains are a great example of this. I don't see a good reason they couldn't be retrofitted with more modern wayfinding, which London knows how to do on modern trains like the new Overground or Elizabeth Line ones. A great example of this sort of leap forward and then stagnation is with the platform screen doors on the Jubilee Line. They're pretty good in my personal opinion, but they haven't been rolled out to other parts of the tube, even as more and more get CBTC. Now, pivoting to New York, I have to say that if New York were to get to the level of optimization and care for its old stations and infrastructure that London has, it would handily win. The network is bigger and it has built-in express services that London just can't compete with. New York also just has the benefit of having gigantic trains, especially on the lines with larger trains, that are probably bigger than mainline British trains, which is an incredible asset that New York needs to better use, probably by making seating and the like more comfortable in its trains, but also with getting those open gangway trains, the R211Ts, out into service. Ultimately, talking about both systems, they still best some of the newer, more modern metro systems out there, both by being more extensive and more refined, something which their great age does benefit them in. If both systems continue to optimize and upgrade, the potential is really impressive. So, thanks for watching today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.